Let's be honest, every American has issues they care about. What's at the top of your list isn't always the same as your friends or family, and for lots of people, the party they vote with doesn't look out for them on topics they want addressed. What if there was a better way for people to vote together to make sure everyone's demands are met? Take Adriana. Adriana is a mom raising her daughter alone who works 2 jobs to make ends meet. She was doing better last year when she had a monthly child tax credit to help with the bills, but since Congress let it expire, she doesn't know what to do. She wants to get her daughter a violin so she can play in the school orchestra, but she couldn't afford it, even before prices started going up. She liked Andrew Yang's proposal for universal basic income to create some financial security for everyone and wants to find other people who are willing to fight for it. Or look at Bob. Bob used to cultivate cannabis plants before it was legal in his state. In 2010, he got a felony conviction and a 5-year prison sentence for growing cannabis on his property. Since he got out, Bob has struggled to get a job, even with a degree and years of experience. He's frustrated because he sees big businesses making money selling marijuana while Congress drags its feet on drug policy reforms. The rest of the world has gone on, but he's stuck with a felony conviction holding him down. Bob wants justice for himself and the millions of other men and women caught up in the war on drugs. Then there's Cassie. Cassie grew up during the Vietnam era and lost both her father and uncle in the war. She hates what war did to her family, but can't seem to get her congressperson's attention. She's angry that defense contractors get hundreds of billions of dollars every year in the military budget to build weapons, while her local school and community center get pennies. The only fight Cassie believes in is the one to bring US soldiers home and end the endless wars. As different as these people are, each has a place in the American Union of swing voters. Adriana's top issue may not be the war on drugs, and Bob may have questions about cutting the military budget. But they recognize that they are stronger when they unite around a specific set of demands. They are diverse voters who understand that in order to have peace, we need prosperity, and prosperity is built on justice. Our issues are connected, our interests are connected, and in 2022, our votes will be connected. That's the basis of the American Union. Alone, our elected representatives have dismissed our concerns. Together, as a union of swing voters, we can't be ignored because swing voters are the ones candidates need to win. Whether your top issue is justice or peace or prosperity, an American Union needs you. Together, we can win us all a better social contract. Vote with the American Union in 2022.
Okay, welcome everyone to the presentation tonight on criminal justice reform for 2022. And I'd like to start these meetings off with the preamble to the Constitution to remind us of our duties as Americans. And so you're invited to unmute and we can recite the preamble together. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The Constitution is very clear that it is our first duty to establish justice. And if you're here tonight, it's because you know that we are failing, that we have 2 million Americans who wake up behind bars every single day. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are in jail because they can't afford bail. We have tens of thousands of Americans who have been kept in solitary confinement for weeks, for months, for even years at a time. Mass incarceration is a moral stain on our nation. And the people that are working on these issues are doing a great job of shining a spotlight on this stain, but light alone isn't enough. To actually remove this stain, we're going to have to dig into the fabric of our laws and our policies, and we're going to have to triangulate the moral, political, and economic problems that have created this system of mass incarceration. So tonight, we're going to talk about what do we have to do to guide America to a better place. The road may look dark, but there is light at the end. There is a vision of an America where we recognize the humanity in people, and we use incarceration sparingly with love and not as punishment. The 3 sections I'm going to talk about tonight are about Satyagraha and a constructive program, about the overlapping solutions within the American Union framework, and the political strategy and calls to action. We'll take a break for questions in between each of these sections. Just as a brief history, my name is Brian. I'm an organizer with the American Union, and I served in the New Hampshire legislature for a number of terms. So I got a chance to see how the sausage was made from the inside. But based on that political experience, my experience with third parties, my studies of Gandhi and other nonviolent organizers like Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez, I developed the American Union political strategy as a way to overlay political change over our existing system in a way that by tying it into a moral framework where the fewest amount of voters could have the maximum possible influence. And reforming the criminal justice system has long been one of my priorities. It was something that I frequently sponsored legislation related to it during my time in the New Hampshire House. But it was the studies of Gandhi and his methods of nonviolent organizing that really crystallized this strategy. And we'll talk a little bit later about the specifics of what exactly is in this legislative package as far as criminal justice reform. But it's part of a larger project. It's part of a larger picture. This is a nonviolent revolution, a revolution of values that is staged with satyagraha, staged with what is usually translated as soul force. And this is the strategy that Gandhi developed during his years in South Africa of trying not to defeat opponents, but to persuade them, to convert them, to help them see the errors of their ways and encourage them to be better. When he set off on the Salt March in 1930, where he was going to go illegally make salt, he described it this way. He said, "Satyagraha works only in this manner. It arms people with power not to seize power, but to convert the usurper to their own view, till at last the usurper retires or sheds the vices of a usurper and becomes a mere instrument of service to those whom he has wronged." Now, Congress has wronged many Americans. It has failed to establish justice as the Constitution requires. But if with third parties and political parties that set out as their goal as to defeat members of Congress, our goal instead is to persuade them that the right thing to do is to reform the criminal justice system. Now, Gandhian campaign has three legs, each which supports each other and reinforces the larger message. And so tonight we'll look at the political reforms. We've got our political system does not serve the needs of the people and is not responsive. And so how do we address that? The social reforms that keep us divided. Gandhi dealt with this issue in India, where the British rulers kept the people divided into Hindus and Muslims, kept them pitted against each other in a very similar way that the American people are divided into Republicans and Democrats and encouraged to demonize one another, and wedge issues are used to keep us apart. So among those conflicts, we'll have to look at addressing economic issues between groups, and then cultural reforms as well. We've lost track of what the criminal justice is supposed to be about reformation as opposed to punishment, and we've lost track of the idea that individuals are all capable of self-improvement and of redemption. And so a proper strategy will address all three of these things in once. And as far as our political campaign goes, mass incarceration is a moral stain on our nation. And so reforming it is part of a moral crusade. And Dr. King, in his Beyond Vietnam speech given 1 year before his death, he told us that our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and to go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal opposition to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo. And the status quo is broken in America when somehow we have 2 million Americans who wake up behind bars, even though we are not the most evil country in the world. Something has gone terribly wrong with our judicial system. So our political campaign takes on a moral crusade to address not just the racism of the criminal justice system, but also the poverty and militarism that reinforce the dehumanizing of people that we need to combat. Issues are connected. And so poverty, the first of Dr. King's triple evils, is a driver of crime, is a driver of incarceration. And the prison industrial complex itself is offered up as a solution to a lot of these issues. It's a job creator, right? We have almost 400,000 people employed in the prison industrial complex across the nation. And by keeping people incarcerated, keeping them warehoused. We remove them from the job market. And so this too goes back to addressing the mindset of scarcity that has become prevalent of there's not enough to go around. And so we exclude people. The prison industrial complex has also led to the phenomenon of prison gerrymandering, where people who are incarcerated in rural districts frequently are counted for purposes of representation, are counted as if they live there instead of the districts that they will return to after their incarceration is over. And so these rural districts are more likely to elect Republicans. And so it creates this gerrymandering creates an advantage for rural lawmakers. And then, of course, there's the prison labor itself. As you're probably aware, the 13th Amendment didn't actually abolish slavery. It just said someone had to be convicted of a crime first. And prison labor produces about $11 billion worth of goods and services in our economy each year. And the men and women who produce that value aren't compensated fairly for it. It is something that needs to be addressed. So like our other presentations about the military industrial complex, if we're going to reform the system, if we're going to bring 1 million people out of prisons and jails, if we're going to put hundreds of thousands of people out of work, we have to have an economic floor to make sure that everyone's basic security is met. And so we'll talk about in a minute about universal basic income as a way to address those economic issues. But swinging back to the cultural issues that we need to address, again, it's the economic insecurity that drives a lot of this problem. Right? This is what Donald Trump appealed to when he talked about building a wall, keeping people out that would otherwise take our jobs because there's not enough jobs to go around. It has helped. People are stuck in this mindset of scarcity, when in fact we should be in a mindset of abundance. We live in a very prosperous country, a prosperous time. There's lots of reasons, lots of ways that we can improve the quality of life for all of us. The only thing holding us back is ourselves. Some of the other cultural issues that we need to address is the dehumanizing aspect that ties Dr. Martin Luther King's triple evils together. Those evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. The not recognizing the humanity in everyone. And this is very apparent in our criminal justice system, where people are warehoused, where they're kept in inhumane conditions, where they can be treated brutally and not set up to succeed, despite the fact that 95% of incarcerated people will be released at some point. Instead of setting them up to succeed when they're ready to reacclimate to society, they're often set up for failure. Solitary confinement, for example, being locked in a small space for extended periods of time, only dealing with people directly in front of you and never to the sides, creates a traumatic experience for people when they're released and have to reintegrate into the real world. So these are some of the cultural issues that we need to address. And you're probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's these security and survival needs that are our most basic needs before we can really thrive as human beings, before we can build more powerful, trusting, loving relationships, improve our self-esteem and our self-actualization. We need to have our basic needs met. We need to make sure that we have enough food to eat, clean air, clean water, place to sleep, some stability in our lives in order to thrive. All right, so our moral crusade requires sacrifice. And the way that the American Union identifies and practices this is through a monthly fast for peace. This is in the Gandhian tradition. It's no food, just water for a 24-hour period. It's something that's free, doesn't cost anyone to participate, does include benefits for our mental and our physical health. And it's a group fast is a way for people to be in solidarity with each other across a nation that's 3,000 miles wide. This was a tool that Gandhi used to unite Hindus and Muslims against the British, was national days of fasting. And it's a tool that America has used many times in the past. Abraham Lincoln declared national days of fasting during the Civil War. After the Boston Tea Party, Thomas Jefferson penned a resolution in Virginia calling for them to observe a day of fasting in solidarity with the people of Boston who are now, their port was being blockaded by the British. And Jefferson George Washington all participated. Washington wrote in his diary how he fasted all day. These are American traditions. We can bring them back in 2022 as a way to bring Americans together, to remind us of that revolutionary spirit of those 5 duties in the preamble to the Constitution. Dr. King identified 6 principles of nonviolence, and among these is that unearned suffering for a just cause is redemptive. And so the fast helps emphasize that we're not asking for these changes because we want them for ourselves, that it is a duty that we take on, an obligation to others to establish justice. And that unearned suffering of a fast gives us the moral weight, the moral authority, the moral high ground to demand that our system of mass incarceration be overhauled. Just as importantly, fasting is very much rooted in nonviolence. We've seen a number of different movements, protests, and things over the years that have had elements of violence that have seeped into them. And so by rooting the American Union firmly in nonviolence, rooting it in soul force, we can ensure that our message isn't tainted by violence, clearly delineate those who are supporting a nonviolent course of action versus those who are not. So those are the 3 main legs of the campaign. The Blueprint for a Better America is the legislative package, is the demands of the American Union. This is a crowdsourced piece of legislation that has been developed over the last number of years as a way of addressing many of the problems in our criminal justice system. In short, the legislative package ends poverty with universal basic income. Ending poverty also includes a public option for health insurance and paid family leave. We end mass incarceration with major police, prison, and prosecutorial reforms, and end the endless wars by bringing our troops home and adjusting some of our foreign policies to better recognize the humanity in people around the world. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and open up the Blueprint for a Better America so that we can look at some of the policies that are included within this legislative package. Title I, Establish Justice, has 3 subtitles. The George Floyd Justice Act is the one that deals with police reforms. First among these is qualified immunity reform. This is one of these many things that was a decision made by the Supreme Court that Congress could fix and yet hasn't. This legislation would reform qualified immunity to ensure that law enforcement officers couldn't claim that they had no idea they were violating people's rights. Section 113 requires a training on duty to intervene if law enforcement sees other officers using excessive force, restricting the use of chokeholds, teaching and training police in de-escalation. That's the Peace Act, the Police Exercising Absolute Care with Everyone Act. Ending the 1033 program that puts military surplus on our city streets. Closing the law enforcement consent loophole for sexual acts for people in custody. Restricting the use of no-knock warrants. Reforming the system of cash bail. Ending federal and state civil asset forfeiture. In addition, it establishes a National Police Misconduct Registry. Subtitle B is the Weldon Angelos Justice Act. This is the section that ends the federal drug war. We've recently been told that abortion is a states' rights issue, and so the drug war ought to be treated the same way. This would return that power to set drug policy to the states. Other prosecutorial provisions include amending the Espionage Act so that whistleblowers such as Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Reality Winner, Chelsea Manning, Daniel Hale could not be charged under the Espionage Act. We'll also clarify the Real ID Act and repeal mandatory minimums, wipe those from the United States Code. And then the last section is the Matthew Charles Prison Reform Act. This would create second look legislation, allowing people who have been incarcerated for 10 or more years in federal prison to ask for a sentence review and, if appropriate, a modification. It would repeal the Prison Litigation Reform Act that creates a 2-tiered system of justice for incarcerated people. It would eliminate the restrictions on Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated Americans. It would repeal the Incarceration Incentive Grants, the program that encourages states to enact truth in sentencing laws, and would provide identification for people who are leaving incarceration, as well as restrict the use of solitary confinement so that the United States would meet United Nations standards of no more than 15 consecutive days of involuntary solitary confinement. And so those are the main criminal justice reform planks that are contained within this legislative package. Universal basic income. Under our legislation, that is the American Union Jobs Program. The American Union Jobs Program doesn't turn Americans into employees. It makes Americans independent contractors, charged with being better Americans, however we see fit. And it serves as a regular reminder of our duties as Americans, those ones that are enumerated in the preamble of the Constitution. So take your universal basic income and go out and establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do those things however however you see fit. And America will ensure that all of its citizens start at least at the poverty line and then work their way up from there. The universal basic income will be paid out in the form of digital cash. The United States Treasury would set up bank accounts for all citizens and deposit $1,300 a month for adults, plus $433 for kids, enough to lift every family up to start above the poverty line. The American Union Jobs Program would be administered by the Social Security Administration, who has very low administrative costs. It's not bloated bureaucracy. As we talked about in the Weldon Angeles Justice Act, ending the federal war on drugs. In her book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander concluded that if we become serious about dismantling the system of mass incarceration, we must end the war on drugs. There is no way around it. And so after 50 years, more than 80% of Americans recognize that the war on drugs is a failure and that we need to change our policies. And so what this legislative package would do is repeal the Controlled Substances Act that so much of our drug war rests on, and wipe from the United States Code drug offenses, and instead establish a presumption that the recreational use of intoxicating substances is not a crime and should not be punished as such, that incarcerating and penalizing people for their recreational use is not justice, which the Constitution requires that we establish. And so under the framework in the Weldon Angeles Justice Act, there would be FDA regulation of purity, labeling, that kind of potency, that kind of thing. There would be a 12% retail sales tax. That money would then go back to fund treatment services for all who want them. Drug use is not harmless, but the harm that it causes to society should be borne as much as possible by the people who would profit from it. So, and that retail sales tax would go to offset some of the harms that it causes. It also includes expungement of previous convictions, and as we talked about, the second look legislation would allow for sentence reviews for anyone incarcerated for a federal drug crime. This is a federal legislative package, and so states can still set their own policies. Some of them will, legalize and tax and regulate it right away. Others will not. This is the same thing that we saw after alcohol prohibition ended, where some states legalized alcohol right away, and others, like Kansas, stayed dry until World War II. But the model that we have now is a failure. And so on the federal level, we can set a better example and end the war on drugs. It has disproportionately harmed communities of color all across this nation. And so ending the war on drugs is really, it's a really important part of establishing justice. All right, so now we've come to the political strategy. How is it that we can influence Congress? The problem is that neither party is a champion of criminal justice reform. Donald Trump signed the most transformative piece of criminal justice reform legislation in 2018, the First Step Act. But then there was never really a second step that has happened. President Biden promised that he would decriminalize marijuana. Even that little step hasn't happened. There's no incentive for politicians to embrace criminal justice reform and to reject the get tough on crime mantra that has gotten us into this mess. And so the strategy is to create that incentive. And the way that we create that is by unionizing as swing voters. Swing voters are the deciders. Swing voters are the ones who decide whether Republicans or Democrats win or lose. Because those are the guys who wins 99% of the time. Third parties are great on principle. The Libertarian Party supports a lot of these reforms, criminal justice reforms, if not all of them, especially ending the drug war. Same thing with the Green Party. A lot of the third parties that are good on principle just can't muster the political power to actually change these things. So by offering one legislative package in all 469 congressional races in 2022, we can offer Republican and Democrat candidates, who are one of whom is going to win in each of these races. Here's an opportunity to win a block of swing votes. And if you need swing votes to win, then politicians are really good at persuading themselves that they should do the thing that will help them get reelected or elected in the first place. The thing is that all these marginalized communities, the people living in poverty, the people who have been harmed by our criminal justice system, an estimated 7 million people that are involved in the criminal justice system, and then of course their families that are also impacted. Like, we far outnumber the swing voters who are actually deciding these things. In 2020, if about 50,000 people in a couple, two, three states had voted the other way, Donald Trump would have won re-election. In 2016, and again, it was tens of thousands of people that could have shifted the election to Hillary Clinton. It's small numbers of people in key states that are the deciders. And so by having one specific offer, one specific national message, end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars, we can take control of the narrative in this political cycle and insist that criminal justice reform be moved through Congress. For 2022, we're targeting 10 key states that all have U.S. Senate seats up for grabs. There are it's about 20 competitive House races in those states. And so by focusing on these, the goal is that a block of 3.5% of the electorate would be sufficient to control at least the outcome of a half a dozen U.S. Senate seats and a dozen or more U.S. House seats, enough to control the balance of power in Washington, D.C. And that would give we the people leverage over Congress. That it's sort of the prisoner's dilemma for the Republicans and Democrats, where, if you're familiar with the classic logic puzzle of the prisoner's dilemma, where two men get arrested and charged with burglary, and the prosecutor comes in and says, look, if you confess and testify against the other person, then we'll let you go. But if you don't and they testify against you, you're going to get 10 years. And if you both confess, then we'll give you guys each 6 months. And so it's in everyone's best interest individually to cooperate, even though together, if nobody cooperated, they would get away, right? There wouldn't be any evidence. So this is sort of that same thing for Republicans or Democrats, where unionizing as swing voters returns power to the people, gives us the ability to set a legislative agenda and to have our own metric, besides party affiliation, our own metric for how to cast our ballots. For Republicans and Democrats who want to keep their power, the thing to do is probably to refuse and say, no, we're never going to take a deal. We're never going to acknowledge that you have power over us. But for them to willingly turn that down, they'd have to be willing to let the other party win. This is the dilemma for them. Should they let the other party take control of Washington? Should they let the opposing candidates win the elections that they want? Or should they agree to end poverty, end mass incarceration, end the endless wars? And so we talked about some of the cultural issues that need to be addressed in this country. And to the extent that greed and self-interest is rampant in Washington, D.C., this strategy leans into that and builds on the assumption that politicians will sacrifice principle in exchange for power. Republicans and Democrats alike, if they're willing to be our rubber stamps, then be happy to reelect them. The American Union strategy culminates in a fast for peace on October 15th, 2022. And this is the opportunity, again, to seize the moral high ground. It's the opportunity to opt out of the lesser of two evils paradigm, the Republicans versus Democrat model, and instead say, we are seizing power in our own way. And so all Americans who are willing to pool their votes to vote with the American Union as a bloc are invited to participate. This is a fast of moral pressure. Well, fast of moral pressure is one of Gene Sharp's, he's a Gandhian scholar who identified 198 methods of nonviolent resistance. And fast of moral pressure, it applies inward on ourselves to be better, again, to address those cultural issues of self-improvement and redemption. It's directed outward at our neighbors, our communities, our families, and say, look, we can work together. We can solve these problems if we want to. The moral crusade takes sacrifice. Join us on October 15th. And this is also a fast of moral pressure upward on Congress to inspire them to live up to our constitutional duties, first and foremost, to establish justice and to advance our legislative package and put it on the president's desk prior to the midterm elections in exchange for votes for re-election. Now, the way that the prisoner's dilemma works is across social media, that we need a specific way for candidates to opt in, a way for them to compete for our block of votes. And so on October 15th, all the candidates in those 469 federal races can either accept these terms and use the hashtag #FastForPeace on Twitter, or they can decline. And we will know where everyone stands. Incumbents then are the ones who already have the power to act. And so they'll have 10 days to put this legislation on the president's desk. If they refuse, then their challengers can win the American Union endorsement. Now, what happens if neither of them goes along with ending poverty, ending mass incarceration, and ending the endless wars? And the answer is the American Union is still the deciders. It still just takes a small percentage of voters in order to control the balance of power in Washington, D.C. That power needs to be used in order for it to be respected and to establish the credibility, the stick that goes along with the carrot of re-election. And so if both candidates reject these terms, then the endorsement may be awarded randomly to say, look, you can refuse to meet our terms, but you can't stop us from being the deciders. And we absolutely refuse to play your game of picking the lesser of two evils. By tying this moral crusade to the 2022 midterms, by holding our own election where we don't have to change the way we vote, we don't have to find our own candidates, we don't have to ask for ballot access, where we don't have to do anything except agree to work together as Americans. All we have to do is agree to this unified set of demands: ending poverty, ending mass incarceration, and ending the endless wars. And when we do that, when 3.5% of Americans unite, we will de-escalate the 2022 midterm elections. We can rally Americans together around solutions instead of having a hateful, polarizing election. Our calls to action include working on legislative subcommittees. We got to be precise in what exactly we're demanding. It's not enough to make nebulous campaign promises like reforming solitary confinement. We have pages and pages of legislation that details exactly how that practice. And so more sets of eyes, especially by people very familiar with the issues and causes of these criminal justice reform provisions, are very helpful. And so we've got the George Floyd Justice Act with police reforms, the Weldon Angeles Justice Act with ending the drug war, and the Matthew Charles Prison Reform Act dealing with prison reforms. So if you're interested in working on any of those subcommittees, please let us know. Further calls to action. So we've got the political outreach. As a union of swing voters, the American Union has a very large political component. And so the outreach on that end includes shepherding the candidates into supporting them, persuading them that it's in their best interest, as well as America's, that we act to end poverty, end mass incarceration, and end the endless wars. Those opportunities include canvassing, event outreach, doing text banking in some states, putting out yard signs, ways to spread the word that America has a different way to vote in 2022. As far as social outreach, there's plenty of outreach opportunities. If you know people who do podcasts, YouTube channels, things like that, always looking to spread the word with interviews, let us know. We'll be happy to appear on those. And then there's many disillusioned voters, people who have recognized that the system is corrupt and it doesn't really make a difference. And so they've kind of given up on the system, which is understandable. And so what we're really looking for here is persuading them that when we act together outside of the two-party system, that we do have power, that we can wield power, and we can use it to win America a better social contract. You're ready to join the American Union, make a $5 monthly contribution to the PAC, and be counted as a dues-paying member. Again, one of the ways that we address these social issues is by solving problems together. So the American Union offers a new political vehicle for problem solving that doesn't require that you give up being a Republican or a Democrat or any of those things. It just requires that you be willing to work together to solve these problems and to address Dr. King's triple evils. Last, we've got the cultural outreach, promoting the monthly Fast for Peace. We have a outreach to incarcerated people in prison, where we've got incarcerated people in a half dozen states or so that participate in the monthly fast. This is an opportunity to really seize the moral high ground through national days of fasting, through these group fasts, where they're not hunger strikes, but instead willfully abstaining from something for a period of time in order to draw attention to our cause. And just as importantly, with addressing our culture problems, is avoiding negative campaigning in the same way that we look for the best in everyone. That logic and that rule applies to political candidates as well. So that concludes our presentation on criminal justice reform for 2022. This is an opportunity for us to stage a nonviolent revolution, for us to embark on a moral crusade to address these issues and do it in a way that brings people together, including incarcerated people, with one consistent message across the country. It looks like we've got one more question in the chat asking, are there any alternatives for fasting for people who can't participate in it the way that it's being offered? And the answer is yes. Really, the important thing is the intention that you bring to the fast, that willingly giving something up for 24 hours. And if giving up food and just drinking water for 24 hours would be unsafe for you, then you shouldn't do it. Gandhi recommended that people who needed to could drink fruit juice or have fruit to let them safely participate. And for people that even that wouldn't be enough, you can voluntarily give something else up for 24 hours. That shared self-sacrifice that gives the fast its moral power. One other way that people can participate in the election on October 15th without participating in the fast is posting a selfie on social media with the hashtag VoteAU vote for the American Union, taken in front of their polling place to signify that they are making a commitment to come back and vote together with the American Union on November 8th, 2022. And so the same way that the fast signifies sincerity and commitment to this revolution of values, a selfie serves a similar purpose. And so that's an option as well. Well, thanks everybody who attended this evening.